Delphine Ashworth stood at the edge of the water and stared at the boathouse her husband had locked 11 years ago. She had exactly 19 days left before the bank took the house behind her. Casimir had left her one key, one note, and 3 words: trust the boat. What she found inside that boathouse would end up worth more than the entire property combined, and it would force her to answer a question Casimir had never asked her directly in 31 years of marriage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Delphine had grown up thinking storms were something that happened to other people. Her grandmother used to say that about a lot of things. Then Casimir died in March, on a Tuesday, while fixing a gutter he didn't need to fix, and Delphine learned that storms had just been waiting their turn. He fell 11 feet. The doctors told her it was fast. She didn't believe them. Not really, but she stopped asking questions after the second week because the answers didn't change anything. Casimir was 72. They'd been married since she was 26. There hadn't been children, not by choice exactly, more by a string of years that slipped past while they were busy running the marina supply shop in Damariscotta and telling themselves next year. The shop had been dying for 4 years before he died. Fuel prices, a big-box hardware store that opened 40 minutes north, 2 winters bad enough to keep half their customers from bothering to reopen their boats at all. Casimir refinanced twice without telling her the second time. She found out from the mail. By the time she buried him, the debt sat at $210,000, most of it against the house and the half-acre shoreline it sat on, including the boathouse he'd kept locked since she couldn't remember exactly when. 9 years. Maybe 11. He always had a reason. Around the floor joists. Wasps. A leak he hadn't patched yet. She stopped pushing on around year 3, the way you stop pushing on any door that's never once opened for you. The letter from Coastal Heritage Bank arrived on a Thursday in April, 30 days from the date on the envelope. Delphine read it standing at her own kitchen counter, the one Casimir had resurfaced by hand the winter before he died, and felt the floor tilt slightly under her feet. Gordon Whitmore came out to see her that same week. He was the bank's regional loss mitigation officer, a title he said like it meant something important, and he wore boat shoes that had clearly never been near a boat. He stood at her driveway with a folder under his arm and told her, not unkindly, that the shop's collateral value had been overstated for years and that the house itself would likely need to be sold to satisfy even part of the balance. I know this feels sudden, he said. It's been coming for 4 years, Delphine said. It only feels sudden to you. He didn't have an answer for that. He left her a card and a printed timeline with dates circled in red, and his car eased down her gravel drive slow enough that she knew he was looking at the property the way a man looks at something he already expects to own. That night she didn't cry, not at first. She walked the shoreline instead, past the dock pilings Casimir had replaced 2 summers running, down to the boathouse he'd never once let her inside. The padlock was old, a brass Yale model that had gone the color of weak tea. She'd asked him once, years ago, half joking, whether he was hiding a body in there. He'd laughed too long at that joke. She remembered it now and felt something cold move through her. She went back to the house and found herself standing in front of his dresser, the one drawer she'd left untouched since March because it still smelled like the cedar shavings he kept in there for his socks. She opened it anyway. Underneath a folded stack of undershirts sat a small tin box, the kind that used to hold hard candy, dented at one corner. Inside was a single brass key and a scrap of paper, his handwriting gone shaky in a way it hadn't been 10 years earlier. Trust the boat, it read. Everything else is just paperwork. Delphine sat on the edge of the bed they'd shared for 3 decades and turned that key over in her palm until the metal warmed against her skin. She thought about the boathouse door, about 11 years of marriage where one room belonged only to him. She thought about Gordon Whitmore's red circle dates. Then she stood, put on her coat against the evening chill coming off the water, and walked back down to the shoreline with the key gripped so tight it left a mark. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The padlock resisted for a moment, then gave with a small metallic cough, like it had been waiting. Delphine slid it free and let it drop into the grass. The boathouse door was wood, swollen at the bottom from decades of damp, and she had to throw her shoulder into it twice before it scraped open. The smell hit her before anything else. Linseed oil, sawdust, something like varnish gone slightly sweet with age. Not the mildew she'd braced for. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust, and the shape at the center of the room slowly resolved itself out of the dark. A boat. Not the aluminum skiff Casimir used to take out from mackerel. Not anything she recognized from 31 years of watching him load gear into trucks. This was long and narrow, maybe 22 feet, covered along most of its length by a canvas tarp gone stiff with age. Where the tarp had slipped near the bow, moonlight through the high window caught a curve of wood so dark and polished it looked almost wet. She stepped inside. The floor was swept clean, none of the clutter she'd have expected from a man who kept every broken tool he'd ever owned. Along one wall, a workbench held rows of chisels arranged by size, each one oiled and resting on a strip of cloth. Above it, shelves of small glass jars, labeled in Casimir's cramped handwriting. Copper rivets, silicon bronze screws, 3/4 inch. Teak plugs. Delphine walked the length of the hall, running 2 fingers along the canvas without pulling it back yet, working up to it the way you work up to opening a letter you already suspect will change everything. When she finally gripped the edge of the tarp and drew it away, she had to sit down on the workbench stool because her legs simply stopped being reliable. The boat was flawless. A lapped strake hull, each plank overlapping the next in a pattern so precise it looked machined, though she knew enough from 31 years around boatyards to know this had been done by hand, plank by plank, over what must have been years. The wood was some deep reddish brown she didn't have a name for, sealed to a shine that threw back the little moonlight coming through the window. Brass fittings gleamed along the gunnel. A single mast, unstepped, lay wrapped in cloth across 2 sawhorses nearby. On the stern, painted in small gold letters, was a name. Delphine. She put her hand over her mouth and didn't move for a long time. Eventually, she made herself stand, made herself look for what she somehow already knew would be there. On the workbench, tucked under a coffee can full of screws, sat a folder, the cardboard gone soft at the corners. She opened it under the beam of her phone's flashlight. Photographs first. Casimir, younger, dark-haired, kneeling beside bare ribs of a hull with no planking at all yet, just a skeleton of steam-bent wood. Another photo, years later by the look of his face, planks going on one at a time. A receipt, dated the spring after their wedding, for lumber from a mill 2 towns over. Another for a sextant, of all things, purchased 18 years ago from marine antiques dealer in Rockland. Under the photographs was an envelope with her name on it, the ink faded but legible. She opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. Delphine, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I never told you why the boathouse stayed locked. I want to explain because I think you've spent 11 years assuming it was something small, rot or wasps, or whatever excuse I gave you that week. It wasn't small. I was building you a boat that could cross an ocean if you asked her to. Not a dinghy. Not something for the bay. A boat built to the old designs, the ones men used before engines, the ones that don't fail you halfway across. I started the year we married. I told myself it would take 2 years. It took most of my life instead, a little at a time, whenever the shop was slow enough to spare me an evening. I kept it secret because early on it felt indulgent, spending money we didn't fully have on wood and brass for a boat we might never need. Later I kept it secret because I didn't know how to explain 30 years of a project without sounding like I'd lost my mind a little. Maybe I had. There's a folder underneath this letter. It has the boat's full specifications, her designer's name, and a letter from a man named Percival Stroud, who is the only person besides me who's ever seen her finished. Find him. He'll know what she's worth, and more importantly, he'll know what she can do. Delphine set the letter down on the workbench and looked at the boat named after her, sitting in the dark where it had waited for who knew how many winters. Outside, wind moved through the pines along the shoreline, and somewhere past the point a buoy bell rang once, faint and slow. She picked the letter back up because there was more, and because some part of her already understood she wasn't going to sleep that night. Delphine kept reading. The letter's second page was written in a different ink, like he'd come back to it on another day. The folder has her sail plan, drawn up by a naval architect out of Camden named Elsbeth Rourke, dead now for some years, I guess. Elsbeth said something to me the day she handed over the plans that stuck with me longer than anything else about this whole project. She said a boat built this way, to this standard, wasn't really a boat anymore once it was finished. It was an argument that a thing could be made correctly all the way through with nothing hidden and nothing faked, even if the only person who ever saw the argument was the man making it. I believed her. I still do. Every plank on this hull is fastened the way boats were fastened 100 years before either of us was born, because that's the only way I knew to make something that would still be sound long after I wasn't around to fix it. Find Percival Stroud. His number's in the folder. He restores boats like this one for people who understand what they're looking at, and he's the only person I ever let see her twice, both times swearing him to keep quiet until I was ready. I don't think I was ever going to be ready, if I'm honest. There's always one more coat of varnish. But you're reading this, which means the choice isn't mine anymore. I love you. I built this because I didn't know another way to say it that would last as long as I needed it to. Delphine folded the letter along its original creases and sat with it in her lap for a while. Somewhere out past the window, a loon called twice, and the sound seemed to come from much farther away than it probably was. She thought about 11 locked years. She thought about every time she'd asked him, half teasing, what he did out here on the evenings. He said he was checking on gear, and every time he'd answered with something small and believable. She wasn't angry. She kept waiting to feel angry, and it didn't come. What came instead was something closer to vertigo. The sense of a floor she'd walked on her whole marriage, turning out to have a room underneath it she'd never once suspected. She found the folder's remaining contents by flashlight. A hand-drawn sail plan, the paper gone soft and yellow, dimensions noted in a draftsman's careful print. A stack of receipts going back 3 decades. Lumber and bronze fastenings and, oddly, a receipt from 2009 for a sextant restoration, the same instrument she'd seen wrapped in oilcloth on a shelf near the bow. A business card, cream-colored and slightly curled, for a man named Percival Stroud. Wooden boat conservation, with an address in Brooklyn. Under all of it was a spiral notebook, its cover softened from handling. Casimir's restoration journal, though restoration wasn't quite the word for something built from nothing. She opened it to the first page. April 1994. Laid the keel today. Rourke says a boat this size, built traditionally, might take 4 years if I'm disciplined. I am not going to be disciplined. I have a shop 6 days a week, and Delphine doesn't know I'm spending our Sunday afternoons out here instead of fishing like I tell her. I feel bad about the lie. I don't feel bad about the boat. She flipped forward. Years passed in the margins between entries, sometimes months between one page and the next. November 2003. Steamed the last of the garboard planks tonight. Burned my forearm doing it and told Delphine I caught it on the truck's exhaust pipe. She believed me because she has no reason not to. That's the part that sits wrong with me some nights. How easy it is to lie to someone who trusts you completely. June 2011. Fitted the mast step today. 19 years into this, and there are still moments I think I'm building a coffin for myself, not a boat for my wife. Then I remember why I started, back when we were young enough that 30 years felt like it would never actually arrive, and I keep going. March, this year, no year given, just March. Chest been tight lately. Told Delphine it's indigestion. Went to see a doctor in Rockland instead of the one here, so she wouldn't hear about the appointment from the receptionist, who is her cousin. Doctor didn't love what he heard. I didn't tell him about the boat, either. Didn't seem relevant to him. Feels like the only thing relevant to me. Delphine closed the notebook slowly. Outside, the tide had turned. She could hear it in the different pitch of the water against the pilings, and the cold had worked its way properly into the boathouse now that she'd been still for so long. She thought about a doctor's appointment kept secret from her by a receptionist who was, absurdly, family. She thought about a burn explained away with a lie about a truck. 30 years of small deceptions, each one built to protect a larger truth he wasn't ready to hand her yet. She picked up the business card for Percival Stroud and turned it over once between her fingers before setting it in her coat pocket. Morning would come eventually. She had a phone call to make when it did, and a boat named after her sitting 12 feet away, patient as it had always been, waiting for the one thing Casimir had never quite managed to give it while he was alive, someone else to finally see it. Morning came gray and low over the water, fog sitting on the bay thick enough that Delphine couldn't see past the second piling on her dock. She made coffee she didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table with Percival Stroud's card in front of her for 20 minutes before she worked up the nerve to dial. He answered on the second ring, a voice rough with age and what sounded like a head cold. "Stroud, my name is Delphine Ashworth. My husband was Casimir Ashworth, out of Damariscotta. He passed in March." There was a pause long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. "Casimir's gone, 11 feet off a ladder, fixing a gutter that didn't need fixing." Another pause. "I'm sorry to hear that. Genuinely." He cleared his throat. "I take it you found the boat." "I found the boat. I've been waiting 8 years for that phone call, Mrs. Ashworth, and dreading it in equal measure. I could be there by early afternoon." He arrived at 1:30 in a truck older than her marriage, a compact man in his 70s with hands that looked like they'd been working with since childhood. He didn't say much on the walk down to the boathouse. When Delphine slid the door open and stepped back to let him through, he went still in almost the exact way she had 2 nights earlier. "Christ," he said quietly, and it didn't sound like blasphemy so much as a small prayer. He circled the hull slowly, crouching to sight down the planking, running a palm flat against the wood without pressing. He climbed a short ladder Casimir had left leaning against the transom and looked into the cockpit for a long while, without speaking. When he finally turned to Delphine, his eyes were wet. "He never let me touch her," Stroud said. "Only look. Twice in 8 years he called me out here, stood right where you're standing, and wouldn't let me lay a hand on the wood. Said he wanted to finish it himself, every plank, every fastening. I told him that was madness for a man his age, starting something this size. He told me he wasn't planning to be old when he finished. He was 72. Stroud's mouth twisted. Then I suppose he ran out of road before he ran out of boat. Nearly, anyway. She's about 95% complete by my eye. Rigging's not stepped, sails aren't cut, some bright work left to finish below the waterline. Everything structural is done, and done to a standard I've seen maybe 4 times in 40 years of doing this work." "What is she worth?" Delphine asked, because she'd promised herself she'd ask it plainly and not dance around the number the way she'd danced around everything else since March. Stroud considered the hull a while longer before answering. "There's a market for boats like this, small but serious. Collectors, museums, a couple of sailing schools that use traditional builds to teach. A finished example from a documented amateur builder. This quality, this provenance, I'd put a conservative floor at $400,000. If the right 2 collectors want her at the same auction, I've seen boats with half this pedigree clear 7. Delphine had to sit down on the workbench stool again. "I'd want photographs, full documentation, whatever paperwork he left you," Stroud went on. "I can put you in front of the right people within the week. There's a wooden boat auction out of Newport that would take her seriously, and there's at least 2 private collectors I know personally who'd want first look before it ever got that far." She was still absorbing the number when the sound of tires on gravel reached them from up near the house. Stroud glanced toward the door. Expecting someone? She wasn't. She walked up to find Gordon Whitmore's sedan parked behind her own car, and beside it, a black SUV she didn't recognize, a man in a camel coat leaning against it with the particular patience of someone used to waiting on other people's desperation. "Mrs. Ashworth," Whitmore said, all practiced warmth. "This is Radimir Blackwell. He collects vessels, among other things, and when I mentioned you might have something down at the water worth looking at, he insisted on driving up." Blackwell didn't offer his hand. "I hear you've got a boat down there worth discussing." "I don't recall discussing it with Mr. Whitmore," Delphine said. "Small towns," Whitmore said, still smiling. "Word travels." Blackwell studied her for a moment, unhurried. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Ashworth. Unfinished amateur boats are difficult to sell. No warranty on the workmanship, no track record, nothing but a dead man's word for how sound she is below the waterline. I could offer 60,000, take the risk off your hands entirely, and you'd have cash in your account by Friday. Behind her, she heard Stroud's footsteps on the gravel, unhurried, and then his voice, flat and cold in a way she hadn't heard from him all afternoon. 60,000, he repeated, for a lapstrake hull built to Rourke's own design specifications, finished to a standard I'd put in a museum myself. You know exactly what that boat is worth, Blackwell. I've seen your name on auction paperwork before. Blackwell's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. I don't believe we've met. No, Stroud said, but I know your reputation, and I'd be careful how much of it you show this woman. Blackwell's smile didn't waver, but he took a half step back toward his SUV, the kind of retreat that pretends to be nothing at all. No need for hostility. I made a fair offer based on the information available to me. You made an offer based on hoping there wasn't a man standing in the driveway who'd recognize a low ball when he heard one, Stroud said. Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound of a man trying to steer a room back toward his own agenda. Mrs. Ashworth, regardless of any of this, you have 19 days remaining before the bank moves forward with foreclosure. If Mr. Blackwell's number isn't to your liking, that's your right, but I'd encourage you not to let pride cost you the only cash offer currently on the table. It's not the only offer, Delphine said. It's the only bad one. Blackwell's jaw tightened, just slightly, before he recovered the smoothness he'd walked in with. 65, then. Final offer. And I'd suggest you take it before that hull sits through another Maine winter uninsured in an unheated shed. Get off my property, Delphine said. Both of you. Whitmore opened his mouth to say something more, some line about being reasonable, but Stroud stepped forward slightly, close enough that his presence did the talking Delphine didn't need to do herself. The two men exchanged a look, got back into their vehicles, and eased down the gravel drive with the particular slowness of men who wanted her to know they weren't finished. Delphine stood in her own driveway with her arms wrapped around herself against the wind coming off the water, shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. You did the right thing, Stroud said. How does he even know Blackwell? Men like Whitmore always know a man like Blackwell. It's practically the job description. Stroud looked back down toward the boathouse. I'd get that hull properly insured this week, Mrs. Ashworth, and I'd get documentation moving faster than I originally suggested. Men like that don't usually stop after one visit. He was right. 2 days later, Whitmore called the house directly, his voice carrying none of its earlier warmth. Mrs. Ashworth, I want to be transparent with you. The bank's position hasn't changed. 17 days remain on the notice. I'd strongly encourage you to reconsider Mr. Blackwell's offer, or any offer, while you still have an asset the bank hasn't yet moved to seize as part of the property. The boathouse isn't part of the mortgage parcel, Delphine said. She checked, that morning, with a lawyer in Rockland whose number Stroud had given her. A pause on the line. I'd have to review the survey. Please do. She hung up before he could answer, and sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat against the wood Casimir had resurfaced the winter before he died, breathing slowly until the shaking stopped. That evening she drove out to the boathouse alone, the fog long since burned off and the sky gone the deep blue orange of a Maine sunset in late April. She let herself in and sat on the workbench stool, looking at the boat that bore her name, and found herself talking out loud the way she had at the kitchen table in March, except this time it didn't feel quite so much like talking to no one. You could have told me, she said. 30 years. I would have understood, Casimir. I would have loved watching you build this. The boathouse held its silence, wood and brass, and the smell of linseed oil, patient as it had been for 3 decades. Or maybe I wouldn't have, she admitted. Maybe I'd have asked why we were spending money on brass fittings when the shop needed a new furnace. Maybe you knew that about me better than I know it about myself. She ran her hand along the gunnel the way Stroud had, flat palm, no pressure, feeling the impossible smoothness of 30 years of careful work. Somewhere in the rafters, a barn swallow shifted and resettled, the only other living thing keeping her company. The following morning, Stroud called with a name. Anouk Devereaux, he said. She curates the maritime collection at a museum outside Boston, does authentication work for the big wooden boat auctions, too. I've already sent her photographs. She wants to come see the boat herself, and Mrs. Ashworth, I have to tell you, she doesn't get excited over the phone easily. She was excited. Delphine looked out the kitchen window at the boathouse roofline, just visible past the pines, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel yet in the 7 weeks since March. Not hope exactly. Something steadier than that. The sense of solid ground finally showing itself beneath water she'd been treading for a very long time. Anouk Devereaux arrived on a Thursday morning in a rented Volvo splashed with mud from the unpaved stretch of road leading down to Delphine's property. She was younger than Delphine expected, maybe 50, with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades learning not to let her face show what she was thinking. Mrs. Ashworth. She shook Delphine's hand firmly. Percival's photographs kept me up half the night. I want to be upfront that I don't say that lightly. Delphine led her down to the boathouse, Stroud falling in beside them, and slid the door open the way she had for him days earlier. Devereaux stepped inside and stopped moving entirely, the same stillness Delphine had come to recognize as the particular reaction this boat produced in people who understood it. "May I?" she asked, gesturing at the hull. "Please." Devereaux spent nearly 3 hours with the boat. She photographed the planking from a dozen angles, examined the fastenings with a jeweler's loop pulled from her bag, ran her fingers along the keel with the same flat-palmed reverence Stroud had shown. She read through Casimir's restoration journal cover to cover, sitting on an overturned bucket near the workbench, occasionally making a small sound, not quite a laugh, when a particular entry caught her. "He documented the sextant restoration separately," she said at one point, holding up the receipt. "This is the same model Slocum carried, or close to it." "Did he know that?" "I don't know what he knew," Delphine said. "I'm learning most of it the same time you are." When Devereaux finally straightened up, her professional composure had slipped slightly, something warmer showing through. "Mrs. Ashworth, I need to be direct with you the way Percival's told me you prefer directness. This boat is one of the finest amateur-built traditional hulls I have encountered in 18 years of doing this work. The joinery alone would take most professional yards 2 years to replicate at this standard, and your husband achieved it working evenings and weekends around a full-time business. What is she worth? Formally, I need my board to review the full documentation before I could give you a number I'd stand behind in writing. Informally, off the record, between the three of us standing here." She looked back at the hull. "I would not be surprised to see this boat clear $600,000 at the right auction, properly marketed to people who understand traditional construction. If 2 serious collectors want her at the same sale, that number could go considerably higher." Delphine sat down hard on the workbench stool for what felt like the 5th time that week. "There's more," Devereaux said. "My museum has an acquisitions fund specifically for vessels with documented, complete provenance like this. I want to bring this to my board immediately. We want to build an exhibit around her, the whole story, the sextant, the journal, the fact that a marine supply shop owner built a boat this significant and secret for 3 decades. That's not just an acquisition. That's a story our members would talk about for years. How much would the museum offer? I can't commit a number today, but I'd estimate somewhere between $500,000 and $550,000, and I'd fight for the higher end given the completeness of the documentation." Devereaux paused. "That said, Mrs. Ashworth, I'd also encourage you to consider the Newport auction Percival mentioned. A private sale is faster and more certain. An auction, given the rarity here, could produce a number well beyond what I can offer on behalf of an institution with a fixed budget." Delphine thought about 17 days shrinking toward zero, about Whitmore's red circled dates, about Blackwell's $65,000 delivered with a straight face. Either number Devereaux had mentioned solved the debt outright with room left over. The auction might solve more than that. "I need to think," she said. "Not long, but I need to think." "Take the time you need," Devereaux said. "I'll tell you plainly, though, since you value directness. Don't let anyone rush you into a private sale below $600,000. I've seen predatory buyers work exactly this kind of situation before, someone under financial pressure with an asset they don't yet understand the value of. You already had a taste of that with Blackwell, from what Percival tells me. After Devereaux left, Delphine walked back down to the boathouse alone and sat with the boat until the light went fully out of the sky. She thought about the auction Stroud had mentioned, the museum exhibit Devereaux had described, the sheer scale of numbers that had entered her life inside of a single week after 30 years of watching every dollar at the shop. She thought, too, about the letters still folded in her coat pocket, the one that talked about an argument a boat could make just by existing correctly. She wondered what argument Casimir would have wanted her to make with it now. Sell quietly to a museum where thousands of people a year would walk past it and learn his name. Or send it to auction, where it might fetch more money but disappear into some collector's private boathouse, seen by no one, the way it had spent its whole existence until now. She didn't have an answer that night, but for the first time since March, she noticed she wasn't afraid of not having one yet. Delphine spent the next 3 days walking the shoreline at dawn, coffee going cold in her hands, turning the decision over the way she used to turn oyster shells over as a girl, looking for the smooth side. She called Stroud on the second morning. "I keep thinking about who actually sees her," she said. "If she goes to auction and some collector in Newport buys her, she might sit in a private boathouse the rest of her life. Nobody but him ever looking at what Casimir built." "That's a real risk," Stroud admitted. "Auctions don't come with guarantees about where a boat ends up. The museum guarantees people see her. Thousands of them every year." "They do. Then I think I know what I want to do." She called Anouk Devereaux that afternoon and told her she wanted to move forward with the museum, provided the board could match or come close to the number Devereaux had estimated. Devereaux didn't hesitate. "I'll have this in front of them by Monday. I don't anticipate resistance, Mrs. Ashworth. I anticipate the opposite problem, several of them wanting to fly up and see her in person before we even finalize numbers." The board moved faster than Delphine expected. By the following Friday, Devereaux called with a formal offer, $520,000, plus a commitment to build a permanent exhibit around the boat, Casimir's journal, and the sextant, with Delphine invited to contribute her own recollections if she wanted to. "There's one more thing," Devereaux said. "We'd like to name the exhibit after both of you. The boat already carries your name on the transom. We think the story deserves to carry it too." Delphine cried on the phone in a way she hadn't in weeks. Not the grief-soaked crying of March, but something looser, something with relief tangled through it. She signed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning at a lawyer's office in Rockland, Stroud sitting beside her the whole time because she'd asked him to. When it was done, she drove straight to Coastal Heritage Bank and asked for Gordon Whitmore by name. He met her in a small glass-walled office that smelled like burnt coffee, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man who'd already guessed why she'd come. "Mr. Whitmore." She set a cashier's check on the desk between them. "This pays the outstanding balance on the mortgage in full, plus the accrued interest through today's date. I'd like written confirmation the foreclosure proceedings are terminated." He looked at the check for a long moment before looking back up at her. "May I ask where this came from?" "You may ask." He waited, and when she didn't offer more, something like understanding crossed his face, the particular understanding of a man realizing he'd underestimated someone badly and would now have to live with having shown her exactly how. "The boat," he said quietly. "The boat. Mr. Blackwell mentioned he'd made you a generous offer. Mr. Blackwell offered me $65,000 for something that sold for $520,000 to people who actually understood what they were looking at." Delphine kept her voice even. "I'd be careful about the company you keep, Mr. Whitmore. It says something about a bank when the collector its vice president brings around turns out to be the kind of man who lowballs widows." He didn't have an answer for that, same as he hadn't had one back in April standing in her driveway with his red circle dates. He processed the payment in silence, printed the confirmation, and slid it across the desk without quite meeting her eyes. Delphine walked out of the bank into a bright, cold morning with the confirmation folded in her coat pocket next to the letter she still hadn't stopped carrying, and felt something in her chest unclench for the first time since a Tuesday in March when a man she'd loved for 31 years fell 11 feet off a ladder fixing a gutter that hadn't needed fixing. She drove home along the coast road with the windows cracked despite the cold, salt air moving through the car, and pulled in her own driveway, to find it entirely empty. No bank car, no black SUV, nothing but her own house sitting solid against a sky gone pale blue with the last of the morning fog burning off. She sat there a while before going inside, just looking at it. Hers. Actually hers, debt-free, for the first time in longer than she could remember. That evening she walked down to the boathouse one more time before movers came the following week to prepare the boat for transport. She sat on the workbench stool and read Casimir's letter through one final time, the part about arguments a boat could make just by existing correctly, and understood it differently now than she had the first night. He hadn't just built an argument that something could be made well. He'd built one that could be understood by strangers, appreciated by people who'd never known him, carried forward long after both of them were gone. The boat wasn't finished being an argument. It was only just starting. 3 months later, Delphine stood on a pier in Boston Harbor, salt wind pulling at her coat, watching a crane lower the boat named after her onto a cradle inside the museum's new maritime wing. Anouk Devereaux stood beside her, and Percival Stroud had driven down from Brooklyn that morning specifically to see it, muttering the whole time about how cranes had no business touching a hull that fine. The exhibit had taken shape faster than Delphine expected. A glass case held Casimir's restoration journal, open to the April 1994 entry where he'd written about laying the keel and lying to her about Sunday afternoons. Beside it sat the sextant, restored and gleaming, with a small card explaining its connection to the boats of an earlier century. On the wall behind the hull itself hung 3 photographs. Casimir kneeling beside bare ribs of wood in 1994, Casimir decades later with gray in his hair, fitting the last of the planking, and one Delphine had found only after signing the sale papers, tucked in the back of the folder. Casimir standing beside the finished hull, alone in the boathouse, smiling at whoever had taken the photograph. She still didn't know who that had been. "We're calling the exhibit the Delphine Letters," Devereaux told her that morning, "if that's still agreeable to you." It was more than agreeable. Delphine had used part of the museum's payment to clear the mortgage entirely and set aside a fund for the shop's remaining debts, the ones Casimir had quietly refinanced without telling her. What remained, nearly $400,000, she'd sat with for weeks before deciding what to do. She thought about the 15 years Casimir had spent building something in secret to protect a future he wouldn't live to see. She thought about how many other widows in coastal Maine were sitting in kitchens right now reading foreclosure notices, farms and shops and homes slipping away because a spouse's death had exposed debts that had been building quietly for years. She'd been one signature away from losing everything, and the only reason she hadn't was a locked boathouse most people would have written off as storage for broken gear. She established the fund that autumn. She called it Casimir's Keel, a small operating grant that paid off overdue mortgage balances for widows and widowers in coastal Maine facing foreclosure within 90 days. No interest, no strings, just enough to buy people the time Delphine hadn't known she needed until a brass key showed her otherwise. Stroud volunteered to help vet applications involving boats or marine businesses specifically, since he said he'd rather spend his retirement keeping other people's hulls out of the hands of men like Blackwell. The old boathouse itself she converted that winter, walls re-insulated, a wood stove installed where Casimir's workbench had stood, though she kept the workbench itself, chisels and all, arranged exactly as she'd found it. She began sketching there most evenings, something she hadn't done seriously since art classes in college. The same classes she'd quietly let go of when the shop needed her full attention instead. Her first finished piece, a watercolor of the boat under sail on a bay sheet invented because the real boat had never once left the boathouse under its own power, now hung in the museum lobby beside the exhibit, a small placard crediting her by name. On a cold morning in January, nearly a year after Casimir fell off that ladder, Delphine stood in the boathouse with a mug of tea going cold in her hands and read the second letter from the envelope she'd never fully finished. Casimir had left her 15 letters in total, one for each year he'd guessed he might not live to see, tucked behind a loose board near the workbench she hadn't found until months after the first discovery. She'd read one a month since, rationing them the way she'd once rationed good weather for sailing lessons she'd never taken. This one, meant for the year after his death, was shorter than the first. Delphine, if you're reading this, you found her, and I hope you found her without me having to explain in person why I kept it from you. I built that boat because I didn't trust myself to say the right things out loud, not the way I wanted to say them. Every plank was easier for me than a sentence would have been. I hope somewhere in what I built, you can hear what I meant. 31 years, and you were the argument I was always trying to make. That something built carefully, honestly, plank by plank could last. She folded the letter and set it on the workbench beside the others, and looked out through the new window she'd had cut into the boathouse wall, one Casimir had never allowed, facing the water where the boat used to sit. The tide was coming in, slow and certain, the way it always had, the way it would long after every person in this story was gone. Delphine picked up her brush and went back to the canvas waiting on the easel, painting the shoreline exactly as it looked that morning, imperfect light and all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.